Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today on the Agile Guide to Building Amazing Service Portals in ServiceNow. My name is Tim Lee with Cerna Solutions, and the reason why we wanted to do this webinar today is we know that a lot of our clients have experienced that service portal projects are traditionally a little intimidating, and they involve certain amounts of creativity and subjectivity that make it difficult to sort of quantify the right and wrong way to go about a project. And what we've done is we've compiled a list of agile methods and methodologies that we have seen as a successful way for customers to approach these projects and have more success in the future. So let's go ahead and get started. If you're not already familiar with Cerna Solutions, just as an introduction to us, we specialize in developing cutting-edge solutions and consulting services that are aimed primarily in the ServiceNow space. That's really our major focus. And what we do is we provide a personalized fit specifically for your business needs in the areas of business process, requirements workshops, integrations, implementations, and much more. And as you can see here, we support customers across the entire enterprise, the entire platform, not just ITSM, but also HR, facilities, CSM, DRC, SecOps, obviously Service Portal, which we're talking about today, and much more. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter, Jeff Pierce. Jeff has 8 years of ServiceNow portal and platform experience. He's a web developer, a UX designer, a certified Scrum Master, and we say this every time, a ukulele, an accomplished ukulele, and scuba enthusiast. How are you doing today, Jeff?
Aloha, I'm doing very well. Thanks for the intro, Tim. Okay, it's a lovely day here in Hawaii. Which means it's overcast and not too hot. All right. Thanks everybody for joining again for another one of these Service Portal webinars. Very excited to have you. Have a lot of information to share with you today. So what can you expect to learn in this webinar? 1, how to confidently play your role in a portal project, how to save time and headaches by adopting best practice ideas, and how to apply effective agile principles to your project. And whether it's a service portal or not, we're going to be talking about everything in terms of service portal projects today, but really this is applicable to any kind of ServiceNow project that you might be conducting. I've done, I would say, it's in the realm of the upper 60s in the number of service portal or CMS and service portal projects that I've done in the last 8 years. I've seen a lot of them go very well, and I've seen some of them go not very well. And I've painstakingly paid attention to the factors that contributed to each over the years, and maybe no surprise that a lot of the factors that made great portal projects were agile concepts. And so I'm a big believer in agile methodology, and so that's what I plan on sharing with you today. Those key agile principles and how they relate to a service portal project that you can adopt to make sure that you have a very smooth experience for all users and that your end product is as great as it can be. So our agenda, we're going to talk about the team roster, so the different, the cast of characters of a portal project. We'll talk about the definition of done, how you know when you can stick a fork in it, the backlog, the sprint, and we'll talk about a good approach to retrospectives, which is an often overlooked set of activities for almost every project I've ever been on. All right, so the team roster. So who are you going to bring to the table in a portal project? A lot of the projects that I've seen not start off very well was because there were too many people in the room, too many people competing for their ideas to be heard. So Agile is pretty strict on who is involved and what their roles are. And of course, you've heard of the Scrum Master, right? This person is the one who is kind of like the project manager for the project. There's a facilitator, servant leader, disciplinarian. This person doesn't have to be a project manager, but they can be. Maybe your more effective Scrum Masters are trained in project management. This could even be a member of your dev team, but under no circumstances shall a product owner ever be the Scrum Master, and there are very specific reasons for this. And the responsibilities of the Scrum Master, of course, lead the Scrum meeting, help the team understand Agile principles, protect the dev team from the product owner, and enforce discipline and methodology. Now, just a disclaimer, as we go through these, it may sound like I'm picking on the product owner a little bit in a lot of these ideas. Not picking on them. I love product owners. In fact, I'm a product owner many of the time, or much of the time. But the product owner does need to remember their role in the project to help things go smoothly. And that's where I've seen a lot of projects go off is when the product owner ends up trying to do too much. So, the product owner is the primary stakeholder of the portal. There might be other stakeholders, but the product owner is the main one. This person owns the vision of the portal. They have a close relationship with all the other stakeholders. This person has the authority to make all the decisions necessary to keep things moving forward. If your product owner doesn't have the authority to make decisions, well, then you've got the wrong person as the product owner. And there may be several product owners, but the key thing to remember with this is they're not all owning the same part of the product. They're owning different parts. So one product owner owns one division of the product, and they should never be overlapping. The responsibility of the product owner to provide requirements to the dev team, to coordinate the other stakeholders for reviews and decisions, and to maximize the value of the portal. And of course, as I said in the earlier bullet there, to own the vision of the portal, to provide the direction of what the end product needs to look like. Okay, then you've got the dev team. So the dev team includes your developers, designers, and testers. Testers, that's one aspect that is often missed here. Testers are definitely part of your dev team. The dev team works as a single unit. They should always kind of be looked at as a single unit, though they can assign tasks individually among themselves. So responsibilities here: assist the product owner in grooming the definition of done, review and point all stories, complete dev tasks according to sprint schedules, document your development, generate design artifacts, test everything. So I will pick on the dev team a little bit here too. The dev team carries great responsibility in the Agile process. You're the one delivering. So, if you're going to deliver good service, good quality product, you got a lot of responsibility and you got a lot of commitments to make. Oftentimes those commitments are difficult to meet, especially when it comes to timeline and things like that. And so that's why it's really important for the dev team to be assertive in everything that they do and communicate very openly and honestly with the product owner. The product owner and the dev team, they really need to be a great working team. Oftentimes we imagine that they're kind of pitted against each other, right? But we got to get over that concept and find a way to get these two parties to really get along. Okay, then you've got the stakeholders. And yeah, I couldn't resist with the image there. But the images, it does have some relevancy. And I'll get to that in a second. So the stakeholders are anyone who is significantly affected by or responsible for the outcome of the portal. So at one level, you've got people like service desk managers, department leads, executives, but your end users are also stakeholders. Don't ever forget that. So the responsibilities of stakeholders: participate in design reviews, provide timely feedback for designs. And when I say design, I'll use design a lot through here. Design doesn't just mean visual, aesthetic, graphical design. Design is the design of requirements, so the functionality as well. And also, another responsibility: identify users who can help provide feedback and conduct user acceptance testing. So, this image is relevant. It's not just a terrible, terrible pun, which it is, but, the stakeholders, they're the ones who are going to be eating this, right? So so they have a big stake in the outcome. You know, always remember that you're going to have to feed this to somebody. So make sure you know who those people are, and that you are including them in reviews and counting their opinion very highly. All right, some things to keep in mind here. The product owner is the buffer between the dev team and the stakeholders. Stakeholders and dev team, they should never meet. They don't even have to know each other exists, really, right? It's the product owner who's in between them. You know, if the dev team develops a demo, it should then be the product owner who demos that to the stakeholders. There's no reason for those two to ever come into play. It's just, it can be a big distraction to the dev team. It can also be a big distraction to the stakeholders too. The Scrum Master doesn't need to know anything about ServiceNow or portals. Their only job is to be an agile champion. Testers are part of the dev team and should be testing constantly. Their findings do not result in officially logged defects. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into sprints. And while the dev team may make major contributions to the definition of done, which we'll talk about in a moment, it's ultimately the product owner's sole purpose of existing on the project to define what done is. And the product owner should never, ever, ever manage the project. It's just not their role. Let them do what they're best at, which is being a visionary of what the product needs to be and managing the stakeholders. Okay, so let's get into the definition of done. Now, one thing that I think a lot of people really get hung up on this, like how do you define done? And I think the reason for that is because they're trying to fit the definition of done into like a 1 or 2 sentence statement, which just is never going to happen. Definition of done is huge. It's a huge package of things. So of course it includes obvious universal requirements such as the code runs without warning or errors, documentation and testing are complete, updates are migrated to production, you know, things like that apply to every project. But the more dynamic aspects of the definition of done, more project-specific requirements come in several forms. Those are themes, epics, wireframes, user stories, graphic design. And I have those in that order for very specific reasons. Those are the orders in which they should be defined. Let's talk about each one of those. Themes. So themes, these are the reasons why we're doing anything at all. Themes paved the way for all of the other things, epics, wireframes, and user stories. So these themes, they're the high-level use cases for what needs to be accomplished. So I have some example themes here from a typical portal project. Users need to manage their approvals. Users need to know the status of their requests, to submit service catalog requests, to be aware of critical outages, to submit incidents, to access intranet links. So these are all just high-level requirements that you can easily sum up in a very short statement. So epics. Epics are descriptions of prioritized features that support the themes. So every theme is going to be broken down into several epics. So consider the theme, a user needs to submit service catalog requests. Well, there are several different ways we can support that in the portal. One is users can search the service catalog by keyword. They can browse the service catalog by category. You can find popular items in a most popular list. You can find new items in a featured items list. So you see, these all are more related to actual features of how we're going to accomplish the theme. Now in service portal speak, you can start thinking of epics in terms of widgets, right? Each one of these might be a widget, searching, browsing, most popular list, featured items list. So that's a good way to think about that. So you might have several widgets that are supporting one theme. Now all of these also ought to be prioritized too. You know, based upon what you know about your users and your content, you should be able to say that, like, okay, search is the most important one here. Browsing by category, maybe not so important. A most popular list, that could be very valuable. So you should be able to start ordering these in terms of their value to the portal. So also include real-life business scenarios with each epic. So your main epic description is rather general, but included with your epic package should be real-life business scenarios. So, for example, a non-rolled user needs a new mouse and wants to explore what accessories are available. So that would be a real-life scenario for browsing the catalog. A manager needs to request access to procurement software for a newly promoted team member. That would be an example of a good use case for using the search, right? So these will help us to create better wireframes later on. And we'll talk about wireframes actually right now. That's our next slide. So wireframes. With our epics defined, we can now start imagining what the portal will look like. And wireframes are not an option. These are mandatory. If you don't do anything else that I share with you in this presentation, but one thing, it should be the wireframes. And treat wireframing just like any other development activity. It is incredibly important to do this because you are going to uncover so many, let me put it this way, you're going to just learn so much. It's a major discussion starter. You're going to learn more about the themes and epics that you've already defined. It's going to help you refine them. So task your designer or analyst or whoever it is with drafting several versions of each page. And I'll show you a couple of examples here coming up. But you can take all those epics that you define, the different widgets that you think you're going to need, and start just laying them out in a very crude fashion to start imagining how they might all fit into your portal. And so it's very important to make wireframing an actual sprint in your process. It's not just a before thought or an afterthought. It's not just a piece of lettuce, in your sandwich. This is actual meat. This is incredibly important. And also make sure you plan plenty of time for reviewing the wireframes, and include that time as part of your sprint schedule, so that at the end of each sprint you'll have at least one or more ready to share versions that can be iterated on in the next sprint. So some wireframing tips. Do the things you ought to do here. Start with pen and paper, just using plain boxes, lines, and labels, or a whiteboard. Try multiple ideas of layouts. Don't think that you're just going to come up with the best idea first. Do a bunch of ideas and do them quickly. This is a brainstorming exercise. At least when you first start out wireframing, use them as discussion starters. Expect that things are going to change and that you're going to learn things. And you might change your mind about things. Prioritize your themes and epics, and then let your wireframe designs reflect those priorities. So if you decided that browsing the catalog was not as important as searching, well, then you want to make sure that in your wireframe design, searching is a much more prominent feature than your browsing feature. Think about your user experiences, how your end users are actually going to use this, and the ease of access for them. Also think about any accessibility, disability accessibility factors you need to consider. And then prioritize the review process. Don't just finish some wireframes and then say, okay, we're done, this is what it's going to look like. No, the next equally important step is to have your product owner share those out to the stakeholders and get feedback on them. So things not to do when you're wireframing. Don't worry about the exact language that's used, especially in your early iterations. As you iterate, you get more refined. Don't think about colors, fonts, images, any of that stuff. Don't expect it to be pretty at all. Don't make them perfect. Don't think that you're complete before every feature and page is represented. Okay, some other tips. Use a wireframing tool that allows you to create clickable PDFs that you can share. I use Balsamiq Mockups and it's great. Super easy to use, and you can create PDFs that you can click on and actually simulate the user experience. Put your wireframes in front of actual end users and ask them to simulate the real-life epic scenarios that you defined. And take at least a month to share and iterate, to create, share, and iterate your wireframe ideas. This isn't just like a 2-day activity, especially if you're building a more custom portal. It's going to take a while to really iterate through all of your ideas to a point that is sufficient. In my experience, doing a more advanced custom portal, wireframing lasts anywhere from 1 to 3 months. In a more out-of-box implementation, you can probably get away with 2 to 4 weeks. But you definitely want to give time to get all the feedback that is useful. Okay, so iterating wireframes. So there on the right-hand side, you can see an example of how, in the beginning, things are just kind of thrown onto the page. We're not worried about spacing at all. We're not worried about, things actually looking like a real user interface yet. We're just throwing features on the page that we know need to be there. So we start very crude and simple without real content examples. We talk about what you like and you don't like. Remember the priorities that you identified. Then go from, say, 3 versions down to 2 versions, down to 1 version. And as your wireframes become more refined, you start including more real content examples. Okay, so the definition of done, as you see, is a big thing. It isn't just a couple of statements. And keep in mind that it is totally reliant on a product owner's ability to articulate their critical use cases and their willingness to limit themselves to those critical use cases. So there will always be subsequent releases. That's just the law of nature. There's always going to be more work to do. So don't expect to fit every feature into the first release. There's no need to. So the dev team is consulted to determine a feasible time frame for the project. If you have a fixed time frame, a deadline that you have to meet, then expect your definition of done to have to conform to fit into that timeline. If you have a fixed definition of done, but a more flexible timeline, then you expect your timeline to be very fluctuating. Okay, so also be aware of the greenfield project concept and avoid it. So greenfield project is the idea that, we're going to start with just this greenfield and we're going to grow anything that we want. That's not realistic. Stay within your realm of reality and what you can actually accomplish today. A good example of this is, okay, say we want in the portal this feature where it shows all of the hardware assigned to a user and they can easily click into it and look at any open tickets about it or open a new ticket for it. Well, if you don't have a CMDB that actually assigns hardware assets to your users, then don't even dream about that idea. Just focus on what you can accomplish today with the architecture of your implementation. Okay, let's talk about the backlog. So we haven't mentioned anything about user stories yet, and that's what the backlog is. Your backlog is just the list of all your stories. And what is a user story? A user story is a further breakdown of your epics, right? So at the top level, you have your themes, more refined. As you break your theme down into epics, which are your features or widgets, and then each widget is going to require several stories to describe what that widget actually does. So writing the stories is a cinch when you have very comprehensive wireframes. So you can see this example that I have on the right-hand side. Of course, you're not going to be able to read what's in those little blue boxes, but those are all different user stories. So you go page by page, element by element through your wireframes, and describe what the purpose from the user's perspective, each one of those elements is. So each story should have a high-level statement written from a specific end user's point of view, and then also a more detailed description where you can expound on that idea a little bit. So it's also important, especially in a portal project, to not just write your stories from the perspective of the end user. Because remember, there's also going to be a portal administrator who has to maintain the site. So consider them when you're writing your stories too. So here are some examples. As an end user, I can navigate to the report and issue page. As an end user, I can submit an incident using a form on the report and issue page. As an end user, I receive confirmation of my submission after submitting an incident. So now, as a portal admin, I can choose which catalog item to use on the report and issue page. As a portal admin, I can customize the incident submission confirmation message. So you can see here's, you know, the theme in this case was users can submit incidents. The epics were, you know, maybe there was an epic for a menu in the header that took the user to the report and issue page. And then there was an epic for the actual page, you know, the actual form on the page. And then you have the epic for the portal admin to be able to, you know, maintain what catalog item is used. Now, for the portal admin, if you're using all out-of-box functionality, developing those are actually quite easy. It's going to mostly involve just documenting where those configuration points are. But it's still very important to identify these as stories. It's going to save you a lot of headache in the end to do this. So some tips about user stories. Write lots of them. Keep them very short and very detailed. Now that can be rather contradictory, right? Very short and very detailed, but the idea is just be concise, but be specific, right? Group them by epic, so every one of your stories needs to be tied to one of your epics. Write them in the first person. You know, as this kind of user, I can do this. And that's going to help you with testing, and it's also going to help your developers make sure that they're developing for the right person. Okay, document only the functional attributes of the story. You know, only what it should do. You know, what type of content is, you know, is going to be interacted with. You know, I guess a better way to describe this do is in the following don'ts. I'll get there in a sec though. And so also write stories for the portal administrator too. Oh, I just mentioned that. Yeah, so I can add menu items. I can define the default search query. All right, so things not to do with your stories. Don't mention any style or UX attributes. So that's colors, animations, image specifications, exact locations on the page. All of that stuff does not belong in your stories because those are going to be specified in your wireframe or more, sorry, the colors, animations, images, etc. Those are all going to be in your graphic design, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Also, in your stories, don't tell the developer what to do. That's for the dev team to decide. You know, these are places to just describe the requirements from the end user's perspective. You know, there's, you know, the dev team may have many different ways they can approach each requirement. It's going to be up to them to decide what the most effective development approach is. So why am I suggesting to write so many user stories? Like you saw for submitting an incident, I had 3 stories from the end user perspective. But those are just 3 examples. If I were actually doing this for a project, I would probably have several more. So getting nitty gritty and even what some people might call petty has many benefits. So you uncover all kinds of gotchas when you start describing the functionality at such a detailed level, right? It makes you think a lot harder about what you can and can't do or what the most effective approach is going to be. It allows testers to efficiently report their defects. So instead of just failing one big story and then you have to hunt through the work notes to figure out what the heck failed and, all of this, ridiculousness, now the tester can just fail one very minute story about the specific thing that didn't work quite right. It allows your product owners to more efficiently define the acceptance criteria, which we'll talk about in a moment. Provides complete documentation for regression testing, right? If you have really, really detailed stories written, and then a year from now, you're going to do an upgrade and you need to test the portal, well, hey, you've got all these stories. You know everything that needs to be tested now. So you'll really be thanking yourself. And then also, it enables the dev team to plan well, because they're going to have much better visibility of the work ahead of them, and then they can organize those stories into sprints much more efficiently. So you're not done writing stories when the answer, until the answer to what happens next is literally nothing, right? So always be asking that question as you're wireframing and then writing the stories for the wireframe. Okay, I click on this. What happens next? Well, I see this, and then I can click on that. What happens next? Until you've completely closed the loop. And usually that loop ends with some kind of submission confirmation message or something like that. So just always be thinking harder and harder about, there's got to be more to this story. What is there? So an average portal should have 50 to 100 stories. I got a portal that I'm working on now that has 180 stories. So of course, this is going to depend on all the types of features that you're going to involve. How complex your content is, but expect to have a lot of stories. Okay, so backlog grooming. You've got all these stories written. You've got 100 stories. You've got to groom them. Grooming is an important activity where the product owner and the dev team collaborates. So the product owner ultimately owns the stories, but it's the dev team's responsibility to assist the product owner in grooming them. So grooming, you're identifying vague statements and mining for more details. So like I just said, you're always thinking about what's next, like make sure you don't have anything vague in your stories. Ensure each story is realistic and technically feasible. Split big stories into smaller stories. So if a user story description takes more than a sentence to describe it, you probably have 2 stories there, if not more. Then prioritize the stories. How critical is each one to the release of the portal? And as a rule of thumb, I like to think 50% of them are going to be high priority, 25% are medium, 25% are low. That's usually the average breakdown that I see. And this will prioritizing really helps with the dev team being able to efficiently plan their sprints. Okay, also in backlog grooming, the dev team is tasked with pointing each story. So points, those are something that's going to represent the complexity of the story. So you can use t-shirt sizes or Fibonacci numbers to point the stories. Points never ever represent hours. That's completely useless. If you're trying to estimate the number of hours each story is going to take, you're missing the point. No pun intended. I already did one terrible pun. So now the dev team is going to use those points for planning their own sprint capacity. We'll talk about sprints here in a moment. But the dev team is going to say, okay, for each sprint, we believe that we can take 32 points worth of stories. And so now they're going to point each story. And so then when they start planning for the sprint, they know exactly how many stories, or approximately how many stories they can adopt into each sprint. And so points are really not even for the product owner, right? The product owner may not even need to pay attention to the points. I mean, that can come into play when you're prioritizing them. You know, so it's good to always be transparent, let the product owner see the points, and you know, no need to hide them. But this is really primarily for the dev team's use. Okay, and so then probably the most important part of backlog grooming is to write great acceptance criteria. So that gives the dev team the info they need to fully support the requirement. And it also tells the testers exactly how to test. And so this is probably the product owner's most important job in the entire project, is to write great acceptance criteria for each story. So examples of acceptance criteria. So if I have a story as a manager, from every page I have access to my approvals, well, there are some things that the dev team needs to know about that, as well as the testers. So we can say a link to the My Approvals page is visible to managers. A manager is someone who is listed in the manager field of another active user, right? So I've specifically defined who a manager is and how I can tell technically, you know, by looking at the user profile, who is a manager. Okay, as a non-enrolled user, in search results, I see only service catalog content from my regional catalog. So the acceptance criteria there would be a user's regional catalog is determined by the country of their department. Country catalog matrix is as follows, and then you might have a matrix of like, okay, this country gets this catalog, this country gets that catalog, etc. As any user, I can see a list of my open incidents. So a user's open incidents are records on the incident table with this query. Then we give a specific query of the records we expect to see in that list. The fields visible in this list are caller, state, short description, and updated on. So you see, acceptance criteria takes that more generic statement of the story and describes it exactly what we expect to get out of that. So of course the dev team can help write this, but it's really ultimately up to the product owner to approve it and make sure that it's correct, because this is what's going to be built, the acceptance criteria. Okay, things to keep in mind about backlog grooming. The dev team has no obligation to work on a story if they're not satisfied with the acceptance criteria, right? You know, if you ask a carpenter to build your house, but then you don't tell him what type of house to build, he's not going to do it because he knows that he's going to spend a lot of time and effort and resources doing something for you to say, well, I forgot to mention I wanted a 2-story house. I was hoping for 2 bathrooms rather than 1. You know, things like that. You need to know the stuff before you start beginning. So the dev team has no obligation to start if they're not happy with how it's been defined. Now, that's not to say they're not happy with the requirement. I mean, it's not really up to them to choose which requirements are valid or not. More so, it's if they're not satisfied with the level of description, or you know, their ability to interpret that into actual technical requirements, and use the states effectively. So during backlog grooming, we have 3 important states. Now I've seen some customers have a large number of states, and it kind of boggles my mind. I've only found use for 3 of them, at least during backlog grooming. So draft, the product owner is still thinking about it. Ready for review means the product owner is ready for the dev team to collaborate with them on it and help define the acceptance criteria and point it and things like that. So only the product owner can move a story from the state of draft to ready for review. And then we have ready for dev. This means that the dev team has reviewed and pointed the story, they've accepted the acceptance criteria, and only the dev team can move the story into this state. And then of course there's in progress, which goes into the sprint then when the dev team is actually working on the story. And then you can have other states after that for, when you're doing testing and things like that. But, as for the 4 primary states, these are it, right? Okay, so let's talk about the sprint now. The sprint is when the dev team is actually working. You're either designing the product or you're developing the product. where you're testing it. So consider the number of stories and the desired release date, and that will help you decide on sprint lengths. Ideally sprints are 1 to 2 weeks long. Keep in mind, you've got to include time for functional testing in the sprint. So a sprint doesn't mean I'm just going to develop and then at the end of the sprint, I turn it over for testing, and then we're going to start another sprint. That's completely counterproductive. And that's why we include testers in the dev team. So as I develop, I should have a tester with me constantly. I mean, it doesn't have to be by my side, just available through Slack or chat or whatever. That as soon as I'm done think I'm done building something, the tester immediately starts testing it. And so I don't have to like log an actual defect then, because the sprint's not over, right? Actually, this is where the term Scrum comes in, right? What is a Scrum? That's a rugby term. And rugby is different from American football, because American football is like, hey, let's go for the long passes, the long runs. Let's get as much yardage as we can per play. Rugby, now I'm no rugby expert. I've actually never seen more than 1 minute of a rugby game. But from what I understand about scrums is that, it's little by little. You move forward a little bit at a time, and you're not going for the big plays. You're doing a lot more huddles, and so your dev team is huddling together through that whole sprint, inching forward, dev test, so that as soon as I get to the end of that sprint, we are confident that what we built works, and we're ready to hand it over to the product owner, right? This idea of I develop during a sprint, and then I hand it over to the product owner and let them test, yeah, that's just backwards. That doesn't work well. Okay, so picking from the backlog. The dev team is responsible for choosing stories from the backlog for including in the next sprint. Now, they should always take from the top of the backlog, and as long as the product owner has prioritized all of the stories, the product owner can be confident that the dev team is working on the most important stuff first. But it's up to the dev team. Like, if I have 10 high priority stories, I can take whichever ones of those I want and bring them into the next sprint according to what I have capacity for. That's my prerogative as a developer. Now, lower priority stories can be chosen to fill in small gaps of availability, but as a rule of thumb, you're always picking from the top of the backlog. Okay, testing. Actually, I kind of got ahead of myself and already talked a lot about this here. But yeah, your testing during a sprint doesn't result in quote unquote defects, right? Because your developers and testers are working so closely hand in hand that they're just communicating in whatever fashion they choose to make sure that what they're developing is, that they're confident in handing it over to the product owner. And as long as the product owner has clearly defined their acceptance criteria, there's no reason why the developer and testers, the dev team as a whole, shouldn't be extremely confident that what they hand over at the end of the sprint is going to pass testing. Okay, but what about changes? Changes, defects, enhancements. Oh my, this is where things really slide off the rails, right? Because if you don't have very well-defined acceptance criteria, you're shooting at a moving target. And I've seen this be one of the major problems of projects over the years. So here are a couple of rules to follow. During a sprint, the product owner may change the acceptance criteria of any story at any time, but the dev team has the choice to return the story to the backlog where it can be introduced into a subsequent sprint, or accept the changes mid-sprint. That is totally their prerogative, right? Because if they're lining up to shoot at the bullseye and then all of a sudden the product owner comes in and moves the bullseye, they don't have to let the arrow fly. They can put the bow and arrow down and say like, all right, we're going to shoot at the next target then, since that one didn't move, right? Now, the product owner, they can be changing the stories that are still in the backlog all they want. But once the story makes it into a sprint, it's fixed. And it's up to the dev team whether or not they accept the changes and continue working on it that sprint. So after a sprint, the product owner may log new stories that are classified as either defects or enhancements, or just, they don't really have to be classified, but the idea is that, it's a new story and not updating one that was already worked on. So defects occur when the acceptance criteria of a story was not met, or development done for one story negatively impacted something somewhere else. Enhancements occur when the acceptance criteria needs to change in any way. In either scenario, new stories are logged, groomed, prioritized, and scheduled for a subsequent sprint, just like any other story. Okay, some quick notes about the Scrum meeting. It doesn't have to be daily. If you got the time, go ahead and do it daily, or if you feel like it's necessary, but it should occur at least every other day, so 3 times a week. It's only 15 minutes long, and you can have fun rules like the entire team must do a push-up for every minute beyond 15 minutes, or whoever causes the meeting to go longer owes $1 per minute, things like that. So only the Scrum Master, product owner, and dev team are invited to this meeting. Nobody else. This is a restricted treehouse club. And only thing you're going to talk about in this meeting are status updates and blockers. You don't talk about changes, planning, design, testing, etc. Any of that stuff. This is just a status meeting. Really, information is just going in one direction. Here's what I'm working on. Here's what's blocking me. And then you schedule breakouts for any necessary grooming or discussions that need to take place as a result, separately from the Scrum meeting. Okay, so what about graphic design? Where does that fit into all this? So design is a dev sprint, right? Treat it just like you're developing code. It's going to be 1 or more sprints, depending on how complex or how big the design is. So this is where you're doing that actual high definition graphical design iterations, what things are really going to look like in the end. So include these sprints to design, and then include sprints specifically just to develop the styles, right? And that's the stories that you work from are easy in that case, because really you're just working from a design blueprint then, and it isn't a functional story. But only do this once functional development is complete. You're going to save yourself a lot of time. So graphic design can be done at any time after the wireframes are approved, because then you're going to spend a lot less time doing the actual graphic design if you already know like where everything ought to be laid out and what needs to be present, what kind of features are there. And the graphical design provides a visual blueprint for style only. Your graphic designer is not going to design user experience. They're just putting the lipstick and the paint on. It's they are not designing functionality. And this is most efficient when done as one of the last steps. So build an ugly site first. Build it, just make sure it works, and then you can make it look nice. You'll spend a lot less time writing all your CSS and your style development. Okay, so where does UAT fit in? User acceptance testing. So if we're doing functional testing as part of each sprint, then UAT is going to go much more smoothly. So that should be scheduled towards the end of the release. Have actual sprints for testing, and invite actual users to take a test ride, right? Don't just have, you can have official UAT testers, but also include end users, because they're the ones who are, they're going to come up with a lot of ideas and feedback. So gather that feedback and use it to write new stories to be included in 1 or more refinement sprints. So when you're planning your whole project, know that you're going to have to do all these things. You're going to have to do design and then develop the design and then do testing. So all of those things need to be their own dedicated sprints. I see those trying to be sandwiched in at the end of projects way too often. Okay, it's got a few more minutes left. I want to have some time, about 5 minutes for questions, so I'm going to buzz through this. We're almost done. So retrospective. Your short-term retro, this is an activity held immediately after the definition of done is achieved. So you've done all the stories you're going to do. You've tested them with UAT, and you've migrated it. You've documented it. You're done. So immediately after that, meet and see how the project go. What kind of backlog were we left with? What kind of enhancement releases and sprints can we plan now? And of course, don't forget to celebrate. You worked hard and you did a good job. Your long-term retro is held 6 to 12 months after the project. So that's where you meet to decide or to discuss how is the site being used, is it effective? You can study the portal usage reports, distribute a survey to your users and see how they like it. Check out the metrics and objectives. Are they being met? What kind of enhancements and adjustments can make things better? What new content, services, or growth is coming down the line that might cause some new development to be required? And then schedule your long-term retro now, right? You know, like when I'm at the dentist and I'm laying in the chair and I've still got the vacuum tube in my mouth, they're already booking my appointment for like a year from now. It may need to get rescheduled once you get there, but get it on the calendar now so it doesn't, you don't lose visibility of it. Okay, well, that was a lot of information, and I hope it was information that you will find useful and applicable to the work that you're doing. You can follow up with me personally. My email is there, jeff.pierce@cernasolutions.com. Also connect with me on LinkedIn. Check us out on YouTube. We have all of our webinars out on YouTube. We've got several other Service Portal webinars that are great that you can watch. Check out our Portal Guru blog, portalguru.cernasolutions.com. I've got tutorials and tips and you know, more theoretical ideas out there. And then if you're more interested in learning more about Agile, there's many good websites too that I refer to a lot, are scrum.org and mountaingoatsoftware.com. All right. Well, that concludes my presentation for you. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'd like to see if we got any questions or comments now. Tim, did we get any?
Yeah, Jeff, we did. Hey, and just a quick note, if you are looking for us on YouTube, you can definitely just do a search for Cerna Solutions as opposed to memorizing that long URL. You'll definitely find us on there. We've got a lot of our webinars there. And there's, you know,
yeah, that's an ugly URL.
Been doing. We need to get some SEO on that URL. Yeah, so we actually had a few questions come in. We had one person that was asking, you know, sprint planning, backlog grooming, retrospective, sprint review, etc. Do you factor in, say, 2 days as part of the sprint, or put these meeting days as gaps between sprints?
Yeah, good idea. Sprint review. I mean, depending on the duration of your project, you can take even like a week, up to a week between sprints, just to catch your breath, maybe handle any defects that were identified by the product owner, plan for the next one, do some grooming. You know, if you're not going to take a whole week, yeah, it's good to say like, okay, we'll do 2-week sprints, but we know that the first 2 days of every sprint is going to be planning, right? So we're not really going to expect to get any development done on those. Yeah, so I think, you know, it's going to be up to you how you do that. You know, and one of the things about Agile is Agile itself is Agile. So you adopt it however you want, however is going to be most effective for you. But yeah, you do need to account for time, whether it's days or even a week, to do planning and sprint retrospective between sprints. Good question.
And another question, a follow-up from the same person, and actually I promise you we didn't write this question our own, because obviously we have our automated testing solution as well, and this is by no means a plug for that. But you know, what about automated testing for Service Portal? Is that written during the story dev or as a standalone stories?
Well, ideally that would be part of your acceptance criteria, right? That could be part of that. Now, you may need to wait until development has been completed to know exactly how you're going to test it. but even then, so when you get to the end of development, you're always free to go and add more information into the acceptance criteria. Like if we have more information on how to test it, you know, that's going to happen quite often. Like when I actually sit down to develop a story, you know, I'll need to let the testers know exactly what they're going to do. You know, maybe I had specific properties that were, you know, had to be developed, and you know, things like that. So yeah, you're always free to go back into the stories when you're done developing them and update them with more information. In fact, you should always do that regardless. You know, update like the work notes of the story to say what you did to meet the requirement.
We had another question. If points are not based on estimated hours, then what do you use to decide when you actually say we believe this is going to take X amount of points for a sprint?
You're judging the complexity of it, right? Because you can ask me, how long is this going to take to build? And almost every time I will be wrong. So that's why you just don't even bother with hours as points, because it will always be wrong. So you judge the complexity of it. Like, okay, well, this is just a label I have to change. That is the simplest story I can think of. That gets 2 points. Now, if I think I have to build a form, well, that's going to be several fields or several variables. I might have to script some logic. This gets, you know, is getting more complex. I would, you know, this is maybe like an 8-point story. You know, so the more things you have to touch, the more dependencies that are involved, those are going to drive your complexity up.
Okay. And honestly, I know that we're a little bit past. I think we were supposed to be at 45 minutes. We went a little bit beyond. So anyone that stuck with us, definitely thank you. Oh, I have one more question. I just have one developer and a product owner for all of ServiceNow. Should I just say, no, we can't do it?
So you have one developer and one product owner. Does that mean that I'm interpreting that to say that one person plays all those roles? So can you do agile methodology? Yeah, you can still do it. That's why I'd say agile itself is agile. So adopt it however you see fit. You know, take the principles that are going to work well for you, and if others just don't apply, then hey, they don't apply. But be aware of them all and try to practice them yourself. You know, however you see. You know, it's an art, right? It's not a science; it's an art. That's the best thing that I can say to that. So, you know, have fun with it. They're just disciplinarian concepts to keep in mind. So however you do that is going to be your own personal relationship with agile.
And something else to keep in mind is before you ever say no, we can't do it, definitely call someone like Cerna Solutions or do our free workshop before you make any determinations that it just can't be done. We'd love to talk with you and see if that's a possibility as well. So everyone, thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it this time. We'll be back next month with another webinar, and everyone have a great Thursday.
Aloha. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.